Today we are going to discuss about land development banks. Land development banks were instituted in the form of cooperative land mortgage banks in India. The first cooperative land mortgage bank was established at Jeet in Punjab in 1920, but it didn't function well. A real beginning was made by the establishment of Central Land Mortgage Bank in Madras in 1929. Later on, the movement spread to many other states. The Land Mortgage Bank granted long-term loans to farmers against conveyance of land and security. Since 1966-67, the land mortgage banks are renamed as Land Development Bank. That is, the land mortgage banks are renamed as Land Development Bank. The earlier name of Land Development Bank was Land Mortgage Bank. The evolution of Land Development Bank in India can be put into three distinct phases. The first phase is the Land Mortgage Bank (LMB), which are established and mainly confined to the provision of long-term credit to the farmers for redemption of debt or acquisition of ownership of right on land against mortgage of land-based securities, which continued up to mid-1950s. This is the first phase, that is the Land Mortgage Bank. Second phase started after the recommendation of All India Rural Credit Survey Committee 1954, recommending the need for a separate long-term cooperative credit structure and also establishment of land mortgage banks in all states. This is the second stage in the state in accordance with the recommendation of All India Rural Credit Survey Committee. There was a suggestion for the establishment of land mortgage bank in all states. The committee suggested that land mortgage banks segments of the cooperative credit system should be restructured to broad base its activities to provide finance to farmers for acquisition of assets needed for improving the agricultural products. That is, they recommended that this cooperative system of credit must be restructured to enable the farmers to acquire assets needed for improving for the acquisition of assets needed for improving the agricultural product. Accordingly, steps were taken by the Agriculture Credit Department of RBI in consultation with the Government of India for implementing these recommendations and allowing Land Mortgage Bank to undertake financing for investment in productive purposes related to agricultural activities like sinking of well, purchasing of pump sets and other agricultural implements and equipments. After the recommendation of All India Rural Credit Review Committee, there was a distinct shift in the disbursement of credit from the conventional function, that is, debt redemption and ownership right, towards granting of loans for meeting credit requirements of agriculturists for investment purpose. Here, the important changes that has occurred is that these banks have started, or there was recommendation to provide financing for investment in productive purposes related to agriculture activities like sinking of well, purchase of pump sets and other agriculture and implements. The RBI had also set up in 1963 a separate body, that is Agriculture Refinance Corporation (ARC), for supplementing resources of the bank. Initially, it was extending refinance support to the Land Mortgage Bank for meeting financial requirements of the central and land mortgage banks. That is, in 1963, Agriculture Refinance Corporation was set up and they provided refinance support to the land mortgage banks. Later on, the role of Land Mortgage Bank was further amplified to cover various non-land based activities allied to agriculture like dairy, poultry, fishery, piggery, sericulture, etc. Later on, the provision of loans was extended to non-land based activities such as dairy products, poultry, fishery, piggery, and sericulture. It is at this time the emphasis on developmental lending, land mortgage banks have acquired the nomenclature of land development banks. That is, at this stage, the vision or the scope of the land mortgage banks were extended and the name of Land Development Bank, or the emphasis of for giving the name Land Development Bank started. With a view to enlarge the function of ARC, RBI had constituted in 1975 Agriculture Refinance and Development Corporation ARDC, that is in 1975. The aim of ARDC was to provide not only the required financial assistance to Land Development Bank but also other needed support for upgrading the quality of their loans. That here, Agriculture Refinance and Development Corporation, which was established in 1975, mainly aimed at providing financial assistance to the land development banks and also upgrading the quality of their lands. The present phase or the third phase can be constructed as the third phase is the present phase, in which Land Development Bank operation covers virtually all rural economic activities, including those in the non-farm sectors like cottage and village industry, handicrafts, village artisans, etc., with the formation of National Bank for Agriculture and Rural Development 1982. With the shift in the overall function and coverage of Land Mortgage Bank after Land Development Bank to a role of encompassing virtually all rural economic activity, Land Development Bank came to be known as Agriculture and Rural Development Bank. This is the third phase. And here, earlier it was for the agriculture purpose. Then after that, it enlarged its vision enlarged its vision to the investment in agriculture. Later on, started giving loans and other agriculture loans and advances to the sectors like poultry, piggery, sericulture, etc. And later on, in the third stage, land development banks have started giving loans and provisions for the cottage and village industry, handicraft, village means the scope have increased, and now the Land Development Bank came to be known as Agriculture and Rural Development Bank. This is the third phase. First phase is the first phase is the Land Mortgage Bank. Then after that, the recommendation of Rural Credit Survey, and now the third phase is that where the scope has enlarged to almost all the sectors, and which came to be known as the Land Development Bank came to be known as Agriculture and Rural Development Bank. The land development banks are essentially cooperative institutions. All the land development banks are registered under the Cooperative Societies Act. In a strict sense, however, they are semi-cooperatives. They are limited liability associations of agriculture borrowers, as their members have limited liability. Unlike other cooperatives, land development banks do not have personal involvement in their functioning. That is, it is in the nature of cooperative institutions and registered under the Cooperative Societies Act, but they are like SME cooperatives, and they have limited liability, or like limited liability association of agricultural borrowers. The Land Development Bank also differ from one another in their constitutions. On the basis, there may be on the basis of the cooperative basis, joint stock basis, quasi-cooperative basis, mix of cooperative and joint stock principles. These are various types of the organizational setup the Land Development Bank can choose for the setting up of the bank. The organizational structure is it follows a unilateral and federal pattern. The Land Development Bank have no uniform pattern. In some states they are unitary, in some states they are unitary, and in some states they are federal in nature. States like Bihar, Gujarat, Maharashtra and Uttar Pradesh have a unitary structure of land development. Other states have a federal structure. Under its federal structure, Land Development Bank consists of two-tier institutions, that is, Central Land Development Bank at the state level and Primary Land Development Bank at the district level. That is, under a unitary system, there will be one tier only, but under the federal system, there will be two-tier institutions like Central Land Development Bank at the state level and Primary Land Development Bank at the districts of the taluk level. Primary Land Development Bank at the district level with branches at the taluk level. These banks were originally organized to cover one or few taluks in the districts. At present, they are eligible to cover one development blocks. All land owners are eligible to become members and borrow funds by mortgaging their land. That is, these banks are originally organized to cover one or few taluks or district. At present, they are eligible to cover one development blocks, and all land owners are eligible to become the members, and they can borrow funds by mortgaging their land. The central land development banks, these members of the central land development banks are the primary land development bank and few individual promoters. That is, the members of central land development banks are the primary land development bank and few individual promoters. It grants long-term loans to agriculturists through the primary land development bank and branches of central land development banks. That is, they mainly provide loan to the agriculturist through the primary land development bank and branches of central land development banks. It raises funds through floating debentures which are guaranteed by the state government. They raises funds through floating debentures which are guaranteed by the state government. When primary land development bank obtains loans from central land development bank, it assigns the mortgage deed obtained from the borrowers to the central land development bank. That is, they mortgage the deeds of the borrowers to the Central Land Development Bank. The Central Land Development Bank float debentures and raises funds against the security of this property. Here, the Central Land Development Bank float debentures and raises fund against the security of these properties. The NABARD and LIC subscribes for the debentures in large amount, and the former also extend refinance assistance to the Land Development Bank. That is, the debentures and the issued by the central land development banks are issued subscribed by the NABARD and LIC. All primary land development banks are federated into central land development bank at the state level. That is, in the federal form of the land development bank structure, all the primary land development banks are federated into the central land development bank at the state level. In some states, there is unitary structure wherein there is only one state land development bank at the state level operating through its branches and sub-branches at the districts. And in the unitary form, there will be only one land development, and it will be at the state level, and there will be branches and sub-branches at the district and the block levels. There is only one central land development bank in each state and one primary land development bank at the district level. The primary land development banks are affiliated to the central land development bank in the state. Under a federal structure, the primary land development deals with the farmers directly, and the central land development bank deals with the primary land development bank. This is the federal structure of the land development bank. Under unitary structure, however, the state may have more than one central land development bank, and they make direct deals with the farmers. That is, under the unitary form, there will be only one structure, there will be only one tier only, and they deal directly with the farmers. In some cases, the central land development bank has its branches and spread over the states, and they do direct business with the agriculture. In the case of the unitary form, the Central Land Development Bank do their business directly with the agriculturists, whereas in the federal form, they do the business indirectly through the Primary Land Development Bank. In some cases, the Central Land Development Bank serve as a department of the State Cooperative Bank. In some states, the Central Land Development Bank will serve as a department of the State Cooperative Bank. The organizational structure of long-term cooperative credit institution differs from state to state. There are at present merely three structures apart from one state, that is Andhra Pradesh, where the structure is integrated. 8 states, Bihar, Gujarat, Jammu and Kashmir, Maharashtra, Manipur, Pondicherry, Tripura and Uttar Pradesh are operating with a unitary structure where the operations were carried out by the Apex State Cooperative Agriculture and Rural Development Bank through its branches. Under 8 states, Haryana, Karnataka, Kerala, Madhya Pradesh, Orissa, Punjab, Rajasthan, Tamil Nadu are operating with a federal structure in which State Cooperative Agriculture Rural Development Banks operates at the apex level, and Primary Cooperative Agriculture Rural Development operates as independent units at the base level affiliated to State Cooperative Agriculture Rural Development of the state concerned. Assam, Himachal Pradesh and West Bengal operating with mixed structure in which at the apex level State Cooperative Agriculture Rural Development operates through its branches. There are also primary cooperative agriculture and rural development banks operating at the base level affiliated to the same apex bank level at the state level. Andhra Pradesh, the short-term and long-term cooperative structure have been integrated for the last 5 to 6 years. Arunachal Pradesh, Meghalaya, Mizoram, Nagaland, Goa, Delhi, Union Territories like Chandigarh, Andaman, Nicobar, the two-tier state cooperative banks are catering to long-term credit needs of the farmers. The working capital of land development banks are raised from share capital, deposits and debentures. Borrowing from state cooperative banks, commercial banks and state cooperative banks are the other source of funds. That is, working capitals are raised from the share capital, deposit and debentures, borrowing from State Bank of India, commercial banks and state cooperatives. A large part of their funds are raised through long-term debentures. The debentures can be issued only by the Central Land Development Bank, not by the primary land development. The debentures can be issued only by the Central Land Development Banks. Loans and advances in India, farmers have to borrow also for the long term for 5 years to 20 years for buying equipments like pump set, tractors, etc. Other development process such as reclamations of land, fencing, digging of new wells, construction of tanks or tube wells or buying additional. A need for special kinds of institutions provide long-term finance to Indian agriculture was earnestly felt, and consequently Land Development Bank came into existence. And here the circumstances which led to the development of land development are given. That is, it is to meet the long-term needs or the for the investment in activities which are investment in activities other than the agriculture, like digging of new wells, construction of tank, tube wells, etc. These loans and advances are provided by the land development banks. Land development banks provide long-term credit to agriculture at the moderate rate of interest and provide for the repayment of loans in easy annual or semi-annual installments spread over a number of years. And Land Development Bank provide long-term loans to agriculturists for permanent improvement on land. They grant loans against security of land or other agriculture. That is, the Land Development Bank provide long-term credit to agriculture at moderate rate of interest and provide for the repayment of loan in easy annual or semi-annual installments spread over a number of years. They provide long-term loans to agriculture for permanent improvement on the land. They grant loans against the security of land or other agriculture property. Loans are usually given on first mortgage and sometimes even on the second mortgage of land or agriculture property. Generally, they give loan up to 50% of the market value of the mortgaged property. Here, the loans are provided on the basis of the mortgage of or on the basis of the security of land or agriculture property, and 50% of the loans are provided up to the 50% of the market value of the mortgaged property. In 1974, a committee named the Das Committee was formulated. The Reserve Bank of India had appointed a committee on Cooperative Land Development Bank under the chairmanship of K.M. Das in 1973 to examine the working of land development banks. That was in the year 1973. The committee submitted its report in December 1974 and made a number of recommendations such as there should be integration of short-term and long-term credit structure. Second one, concrete effort should be made to recover overdue. Lending operation of land development banks should be diversified by linking them with a specific and other rural development program. Fourth, there should be strengthening of the technical and managerial staff. These are the recommendations given by the Das Committee of 1974. That Das Committee submitted its reports about the working of the cooperative land development banks, and the major suggestions given by Das Committee are that there should be an integration of short-term and long-term credit structure. A concrete effort should be made to recover overdue. Lending operation of land development bank should be diversified, and there should be strengthening of technical and managerial staff. Some of the important problems faced by the land development banks are given in this section. Here we can see that one of the important problems faced by the land development banks are that they mainly provided loans for discharging of prior debt than for the purpose connected with the land improvement. This created problems with their functioning. Second one, these banks do not have a necessary specialized staffs for accessing the technical soundness of schemes and adequate supervising staffs for verifying that the schemes are in fact executed. They usually charge a very high rate of interest. Second one, and another problem is that no second loans are given until the first one is repaid. And another problem is that there will be a delay in granting loans, and they give loans only up to 50% of the market value land mortgage. Thus, very high margin is kept. These are some of the important problems faced by the land mortgage bank. And some other problems, like they adopt complicated procedures which ultimately force the illiterate farmers to resort to the money lenders. Their procedures are so complicated that there will be problems for the farmers to accommodate with these procedures, and they usually meet some other, or they usually resort to the money lenders to meet their financial requirements. Loans are granted to discharge prior debt rather than for the land improvement. These banks do not prescribe different periods for different types of loans. They are not able to raise sufficient fund, although their debentures are guaranteed by the state government, mounting overdues. There is no coordination between the activities of the state cooperative bank and land development bank. Another difficulty is regarding land as a form of security. Its valuation, titles, ownership, etc. are to be checked. That here the problem is difficulty in regarding the valuation of the land. In this section, a brief description about the state cooperative agriculture and rural development banks are given. These are a central sector scheme of India, and it aims at raising resources of state land development banks. These cooperative banks were earlier known as land development banks, and they are now called agriculture and rural development bank. They operate under two-tier system, that is state cooperative agriculture and rural development SCARD and primary cooperative and agriculture rural development PCARDB. State cooperative agriculture rural development bank have now been permitted to accept term deposit for a maturity period of 1 year and above, like that of commercial bank. And Agriculture and Rural Development Bank make long-term lending for schemes associated with increasing the agricultural output, such as digging of they make schemes, or they mainly provides lending for increasing the agricultural output. State cooperative agriculture and rural development banks area of operation are minor or irrigation, farm mechanization, land development, horticulture, wasteland development, rural housing, rural down, non-farm sectors, and animal. Long-term lending to cultivators by way of floating of debentures. The means of raising funds are by floating debentures. The debentures floated by the banks are subscribed by NABARD and the concerned state government, Government of India, and other financial institutions. Initially, the land development banks were instituted in the form of the cooperative land mortgage bank, and the first cooperative land mortgage bank was established in Jind in Punjab in 1920. A real beginning was made by the establishment of Central Land Mortgage Bank in Madras in 1929. The Land Mortgage Bank grant long-term loans to the farmers against the conveyance of land as security. Since 1966-67, the land mortgage banks are renamed as Land Development Bank, and the land development banks are essentially cooperative institutions, and they are registered under the Cooperative Societies Act. They act as a semi-cooperatives and they have limited liabilities. Unlike other cooperative land development banks, do not have personal involvement in their functioning. A large part of their funds are raised through long-term debentures. Under its federal structure, Land Development Bank consists of two tiers, the Central Land Development Bank and Primary Land Development Bank. Under the federal structure, the primary land development deals with the farmers directly, and the central land development banks deals with the primary land development banks. Under unitary structure, our state may have more than one central land development bank, and they make direct deals with the farmers. In some cases, the central land development bank has its branches spread over the states, and they do not do directly deal with the people. In some cases, central land development banks serve as the department of state cooperative bank. These are the important features or the functions of land development banks.